Hello and welcome to Ficheall.ie, and today we are going to look at castling. Castling is a special chess move that involves the king and the rook. It is the only time in chess that the king can move two squares and two pieces can be moved at the same time. When referring to a chessboard, it can be divided vertically into two halves. From white's perspective, on the right hand side you have the king side, and on the left hand side you have the queen side. These terms are very important when we're learning about castling. So, how do you castle? Let's take a look. For this example, we are going to be looking at the white king and the rook on the king's side of the board. Now, there are a couple of rules we must remember when we are learning to castle. Firstly, there can be no other piece between the king and the rook that you are trying to castle with. In other words, the squares between the king and the rook you are trying to castle with must be empty. Next, you move your king two squares in the direction of the rook you are castling with. In this example, you move your king two squares to the right. Finally, you move your rook to the other side of the king. Now, what if you wanted to castle with the rook on the queen side of the board? Again, there can be no pieces in between the king and the rook that you are going to castle with. You will then move your king two squares in the direction of the rook that you are going to castle with, or for this example, two squares to the left. You will then take your rook and place it at the other side of the king. There are some more rules to castling we must learn. In order to castle, you must not have moved your king. If you have moved your king at any stage of the game before castling, then you can no longer castle. Also, if you have moved your rook before castling, then you can no longer castle with that rook. For this example, the rook on the king's side has moved, so we cannot castle with that rook. However, because we have not moved the king, and we have not moved the rook on the queen side, we can still castle with the rook on the queen side. So in other words, in order to castle, you must not have moved your king or the rook that you are planning to castle with. Now let's look at some more examples of castling. In this example, the black king will castle with the rook on the king's side. There are no pieces in between the king and the rook. Either the king or rook have a move before this, so the king can castle by moving two squares in the direction of the rook, and then the rook can be placed at the other side of the king. Here we have the same example again, but this time the black king will castle with the rook on the queen side. Now let's look at castling in a game situation. It's white to move. White can castle with the rook on the king's side. White cannot castle with the rook on the queen side because there are pieces in its way. White has not moved its king or the rook on the king's side, so it can castle by moving two spaces or two squares towards the rook and bringing the rook to the other side. Now it's black to move. Black can castle with the rook on the queen's side. Black cannot castle with the rook on the king's side because there is a bishop in the way. Black has not moved its king or the rook on the queen's side, so it can castle by moving its king two spaces or two squares towards the rook and bringing the rook to the other side. For this example, it's black to move. Black is in check by the white bishop. When you are in check, you cannot castle. So you cannot castle to get out of check, or you cannot castle when you are in check. It's black to move for our next example again. The white bishop is attacking g8. g8 is an unsafe square, so the king cannot castle because it will be moving into check. In chess, you are not allowed to move into check, or the king is not allowed to move into an unsafe square. In our next example, the white knight is attacking the black rook on the king's side. In this example, black can still castle. You are still allowed to castle if the rook you are castling with is under attack or being threatened. For our final example, the white queen is attacking d8. d8 is an unsafe square. You cannot castle in this example because the king cannot move through a check square, or the king cannot move through an unsafe square to castle. It is important to note that the king cannot pass through an attack square, but the rook can pass through an attack square when you are castling. So let's recap on other scenarios where you cannot castle. You cannot castle if you have already moved your king. You cannot castle if you've already moved the rook you were planning to castle with. You cannot castle if there are any pieces between the king and the rook that you were planning to castle with. You cannot castle if you are in check, and you cannot castle if the square your king is moving into is an unsafe square. Finally, you cannot pass through an attack square with your king when castling. Now you might be wondering, why should I castle in a game of chess? Well, castling allows you to achieve two things. Firstly, it allows you to move your king into a safer position rather than the middle of the board, making it more difficult for your opponent to get a checkmate on you. And secondly, it allows you to develop your rook and move it into a more active position. Let's look back on some important points of today's video. In order to castle, you must not have moved either the king or the rook that you were castling with. There can be no pieces between the king and the rook you were castling with. The squares between the king and the rook must be empty. The king moves 2 spaces in the direction of the rook that it is castling with. The rook then moves to the other side of the king. You must always move the king first and then move the rook afterwards. So you move the king first and then you move the rook. You are not allowed to castle if you are moving into check or if your king is moving into an unsafe square. Finally, you are not allowed to castle if you are in check. So you cannot castle to get out of check. I hope you've enjoyed our video on castling. Check it out on your chessboard.